History as it happens, October 28, 2021. The stunning success of German reunification.
Astonishing news from East Germany, where the East German authorities have said, in essence, that the Berlin Wall doesn't mean anything anymore.
Our objective is Europe whole and free.
Proper reunification, I think, is some way down the road. It's just too difficult to talk about reunifying two different states.
31 Octobers ago, what had once seemed impossible was suddenly reality, taking shape in surreal scenes of Germans, East and West, embracing, after the fall of the wall, the restoration of one Germany. And the past 31 years may have been the best in German history, but as Angela Merkel prepares to leave power, what's next for the most important country in Europe? Let's look back and ahead, next, as we're joined by Sir Ian Kershaw, as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
It's happened. It's official. Germany is now one country of 80 million people, and considering that the Berlin Wall went down...
I found myself in Berlin, West Berlin, with my two sons, and then teenagers, on a research year at precisely the time, as it turned out, that the wall was going to come down, and we saw all the events that took place in that momentous year folding before our eyes.
I remember gazing up at the big world maps pinned to the walls of my classrooms. The USSR was huge. The Eastern Bloc, the smaller Soviet republics, it all seemed so menacing and foreign. And to my young eyes, it looked like communism had been there forever, suffocating much of the globe, and would stay there forever. This was the 1980s, and I could not have known, being a generally clueless kid, that the story was coming to an end. Soviet communism would soon be gone.
Your reflections are much the same as younger Europeans would have now. I've been to Berlin with students and with members of my family and so on, and of course, they can theoretically understand it, but they can't really grasp what it was like to have these two completely separate parts of Europe.
And that's Sir Ian Kershaw, one of the finest historians on the planet. He is our guest today. Our conversation is coming up in a bit. The story of German reunification, which could not have happened without the disintegration of Soviet communism, is why history is so fascinating. What seems permanent is suddenly, irreversibly gone. And there was nothing inevitable about it either. It involved decisions by important individuals and the courage of millions of people in Eastern Europe who took to the streets to demand freedom from a crumbling repressive system. So about those important individuals, none was more important than...
Mr. Gorbachev.
Wait, say that again, Mr. Reagan?
Mr. Gorbachev.
See what I did there? I bet you expected to hear Reagan's famous line, as if he were the most important actor, no pun intended. Well, Reagan did play an important role in de-escalating the Cold War in his second term. But Mikhail Gorbachevs...
Mr. Gorbachev...
was most important of all, at least in terms of individuals. His reforms began loosening the vice. He let the Soviet satellite states go their own way. He forbid the use of force to stop East Germans from demanding their rights. And he ultimately assented to the new unified Germany becoming part of NATO. And Gorbachev didn't actually have to listen to Reagan.
Tear down this wall.
He didn't have to tear down the wall. It came down by accident, at least at first. So we Americans can find inspiration in Reagan's speech at the Brandenburg Gate. Also inspiring, maybe even more inspiring, was West German leader Helmut Kohl speaking to an enormous crowd in Dresden, in East Germany, December 1989. The crowd chanted, "Germany United Fatherland." Kohl responded his aim would be the unity of our nation, as he put it.
Und wir werden niemanden bevormunden. Wir respektieren das, was Sie entscheiden für die Zukunft.
And that was one of many key, dramatic moments along the way to reunification, which, just months earlier, had been a pipe dream. I began reading Sir Ian Kershaw's books about 15 years ago. He is best known for his groundbreaking scholarship on the Third Reich. He is the author of an unparalleled 2-volume biography of Hitler, one of the most impressive studies I've ever read. But he is done writing about the Nazis, good for him, and most recently he penned The Global Age, Europe 1950 to 2017 for the Penguin History of Europe series. It is my honor to welcome Ian Kershaw.
Thank you. It's lovely to be with you today.
And as our listeners know, I am a great admirer of your work. I've read just about everything you have written. In your most recent book, The Global Age, about post-war Europe, in your preface you make an astonishing admission that it was the most difficult book or most challenging book you've ever written. That's something, considering you have tackled some rather challenging and difficult subjects beforehand. Why was that?
I think the reason is that there is no one obvious cohesive theme that runs through the history of Europe from 1949, when I began the book, until 2017, when I ended it. It's fragmentary, that history. It fits together from lots of different parts, whereas the previous book I did, To Hell and Back, on the first half of the 20th century, was a half a century dominated by war. And so war provided the theme: First World War, aftermath of the First World War, prelude to the Second World War, Second World War. It was pretty obvious, but the second volume then, on The Global Age, was much more difficult for the reasons I've given, to piece together all the different aspects of the different countries that form Europe, but didn't have a single thread running through their history. So I found it, although it's the history of my own lifetime in a way, I found it very, very difficult to write.
That's right, and you were in Germany for quite a while there. Was that when reunification happened or beforehand? Remind me.
Yes, no, I found myself in Berlin, West Berlin, with my two sons, and then teenagers, on a research year at precisely the time, as it turned out, that the wall was going to come down, and we saw all the events that took place in that momentous year unfolding before our eyes.
So before we get to those historic moments, I'd like to ask you a little bit about our current moment, and that is Angela Merkel, who has been Chancellor of Germany for 16 years. She is stepping aside. There will be a new government and potentially a new chancellor in place by December. What do you see as Merkel's most important accomplishments, both within Germany and for all of Europe, with Germany at its heart?
What Angela Merkel has brought to European politics has been calm and assurance, and a readiness to strike very important compromises both within Germany and within the European Union, which have been essential to the smooth running of both of those political entities. And she's exuded this calmness throughout. She's never been flustered. She's been ready to take a pragmatic, often opportunistic approach within the values which have been forged in post-war Germany and have been embedded in the European Union. This has stood her and her country and the European Union overall in extremely good stead during her 16 years in office.
Not a charismatic leader, but that's okay, right?
It's better than okay. I think we've had enough charismatic leaders.
Well, as Americans, I'm not sure how many Americans, myself included, pay close attention to the internal political dynamics in any foreign countries. We pay some attention to international affairs and foreign policy of these countries. Merkel became a European leader, did she not? And she seemed to also, especially near the end here, push back against a reversion to an inward-looking nationalism in Hungary, for instance, that threatens the ideals upon which the EU is built, to borrow a phrase from your book.
Yes, Angela Merkel represents a Germany which is a fundamental component of the European Union. And the two things go together, because post-war Germany has been the most stalwart and strong supporter of a united Europe. And since the unification in 1990, a united Germany has been the most powerful country economically and also politically in the new Europe. And so it's obvious that the chancellor, the head of government in that country, is going to be the key figure in the European Union as well as in her own country. And Merkel has played that part absolutely to perfection, because she embodies all the ideals which the European Union stands for, and she's seen it as her role to sustain and to uphold these ideals across the continent when they're being, of course, endangered in certain places, and not every country has moved at the same pace. Hungary, you mentioned, Poland is another one where some of the values which are central to the ideal of the European Union seem under threat. Values of course, the rule of law and of human rights and so on.
Pluralistic politics, market or neoliberal economics as well. But in Germany, too, there's been a right-wing backlash, although the Alternative for Germany, which is the far-right party, did poorly in the last round of elections, right?
Yes, it did. And Germany is a normal European country. And what we see there with the Alternative for Germany is a populist movement, which is not dissimilar, except in its precise German characteristics, not dissimilar from movements which we see in most other parts of Europe. Of course, because of the history of Germany, we take particular notice of the right-wing alternative there. We don't bother, incidentally, so much about the right-wing movements in Italy, in the other major fascist country of the pre-war and wartime era. The right-wing populism was much stronger than in Germany. And we have to remember that in Germany, although it has made headway, especially in the eastern parts of Germany, the former areas of the former German Democratic Republic, that the right-wing Alternative for Germany is still a minority party there with about 12 or 13% of the vote.
And also the notion that Europe meaning the EU, needs a strong, united, even powerful Germany, because at one point in the recent past, that notion was still rather controversial for the obvious historical reasons.
Yes, of course. It was a very concerning point at the time of German unification. And to that matter, in certain senses, still is. The question of Germany's position in Europe is one which is awkward in a way for the Germans themselves, because, as I said earlier, Germany is the most economically powerful country in Europe. It's has the strongest economy. It's the biggest country. And yet, for historical reasons, Germany doesn't want to play a part of the leader of Europe. So it's in a position where de facto it is the leader of Europe, but doesn't actually want to have a part to play in the way that might upset its neighbors.
We will get to reunification 31 years ago, but one more point or two about this current moment we're in. As you detail in the closing chapters of your marvelous book, Europe, despite all the gains it has made over the past 31 years, since the end of the Cold War and German reunification, faces some real challenges right now. Mass migration, which caused a right-wing backlash. There's the threat of migration again if Afghanistan falls to pieces once more. There are other challenges. What are they in your view?
The most important ones are the ones you've already mentioned. Beyond those is the question which bedevils every European country, as it does the USA and elsewhere. That is the question of gross social inequalities and economic inequalities. And that is, in a way, the basis of every form of political protest and upset that you find in Germany as in other countries. And at the root of the rise of the neo-right in Germany, especially in the less wealthy parts of Eastern Germany, has been exactly that inequality, which the other things, the migration issue that you mentioned, feeds into. This will be an important element obviously in the future. The nature of the new government is as yet unknown, but almost certainly will be the so-called traffic light coalition of the Social Democrats, the Greens, and the Free Democrats, the Liberals. And the problem with that, and much of the future of Germany and of Europe will depend on how that new coalition shapes up, is that the Greens and the Social Democrats will easily form a coalition. The Free Democrats, which is basically a business party looking at neoliberal free market economics, that is more difficult to fit in. The leader of the Free Democrats, Christian Lindner, is a very forthright character, and whether he will enter the government if he doesn't get the finance ministry is still a moot point. And if Lindner gets the finance ministry, then we probably are in for more conservative neoliberal politics, which will then stand in the way in Germany and in Europe more widely of the sort of policies that many economists really think are necessary now for the development of Europe in the coming years.
And there's also the issue of what will Europe be, or what is Europe? What do we mean by the EU? So we have the United States of America, but each of the individual 50 states is not its own nation. There is no, as you say in your book, There is no United States of Europe. That's not what the EU is, and it won't become that. It does have a supranational element to it that chafes people in countries like Hungary. So it's an interesting dynamic there that's playing out, right?
It's been a dynamic and a dilemma in a way which has run through the entire history of the European Union, and before that the European Economic Community that led into the European Union. Whether it will develop as a supranational entity or as a United States of Europe, meaning a set of nation states which are loosely bonded together. The trajectory it's taken has been towards greater integration, but this has met numerous obstacles along the way, especially since the aftermath of the unification, the Treaty of Maastricht in 1992, which formed the European Union actually, but which has then created the pressures for closer political as well as economic unity. And this has always been a sticking point, so that it, as you said, the European Union is very different from the United States of America, despite the fact that that is, in a way, a sort of model that some people were looking to when they were talking to ever closer union and finally to political union. We have here 26 countries. It was 27 before Britain left, each with a different history, different language, different culture, and so on. So they are not like the federal states of the United States of America at all. And there is no one supranational entity which represents all these bodies, and nor is it likely that there will be such an entity. So the notion of a United States of Europe in that sense, I think, is unlikely to come about.
So, Sir Ian, these are my great interviewing skills. 15 minutes into the interview, finally getting to the subject that I invited you on to discuss, German reunification.
Well, they're important questions.
I think this is good because it creates a little context for the historical aspect of the discussion. German reunification, 31 years ago. When did the idea first surface about reuniting Germany? When did, for instance, anyone in a position of influence begin talking out loud about ending Germany's division?
December 1989, I would say. In one sense, of course, the idea of unification was there right from the beginning of the divided Germanies. That is to say, theoretically, in Western Germany, as it was after 1949, when the German division was sealed, after 1949, Western Germany theoretically still held on to the notion of a future unification of Germany. And incidentally, that didn't just mean the German Democratic Republic, but parts of what are now in Poland and even stretching into bits of Western Russia, which were formerly eastern provinces of Germany until the end of the Second World War. The idea of unification was there throughout, but nobody had any notion that this was a realistic proposition. The longer time went on, the more it seemed just a distant dream. And then in the context of 1989, the prospect arose, first of all, of the satellite countries of the Soviet Union starting to collapse. One of these was the German Democratic Republic, what we commonly call East Germany. By 1989, that was a state of terminal collapse. In November 1989, the Berlin Wall was opened up. All this was fostered by Gorbachev's policies in the Soviet Union towards the satellite states. At first, however, even when the wall was opened, people were not thinking of imminent unification of the country. That started to change in November and December 1989. On the 28th of November, Helmut Kohl, the German chancellor, put forward a 10-point plan, which he was very careful not to speak about in terms of unification. He spoke about a confederation between East and West Germany. So there was nothing about unification taking place within a few months. That started to change in December. And in December 1989, Kohl went to speak to a mass gathering in Dresden, and there was a huge crowd, gave him an absolutely ecstatic welcome. And while he was there, he spoke about, enthused by the crowd, he spoke about the possibility, perhaps, of unifying this country if the historic hour should present itself. And Kohl himself went away thinking this meeting in Dresden had been for him like an epiphany. It was a turning point for him. And after that, he started more and more thinking that this historic hour was in fact not so far away. And then the major changes took place quite rapidly from January and February 1990 onwards, when the East German leader, then Hans Modrow, persuaded Gorbachev that nothing could stand in the way of unification, that it was going to happen anyway. And from there on in, it was a question then of persuading the occupying powers of Berlin, the four wartime powers, that the unification had to take place. The most important were President Bush of the United States and, above all, President Gorbachev of the Soviet Union.
So late 1989, early 1990, the East German people wanted reunification by this point. It was their government, inaccurately and strangely named the German Democratic Republic. It was not a republic or a democracy, whose leader, and of course with the backing of the Soviet Union for all those years, who was afraid of reunification. But in a sense, it had been happening because so many people were leaving, even before the wall came down, but especially after it. People were leaving East Germany to go to the West.
Yes, we shouldn't even so predate the notion that the East Germans wanted unification. Some of them did. The desire for unification was actually stronger in the West than it was in the East in those first weeks. And I remember the time that I was there's a lot of people in East Germany, especially intellectuals and people who were, in a way, the mainstays of the movement to end the system there, were actually wanting a new form of socialism, as they called it, or communism, you might want to call it, a more humane form of communism, rather than the capitalism of the West. But that changed very rapidly. And initially, the German people, who were assembling in greater numbers, wanted to end their system of government there. They were talking about, within a few weeks, of United Germany's fatherland, saying we are the people to we are one people. And the United Germany fatherland then became a sense of movement from below, strong pressure, growing pressure from below for unification. That was the pressure that Modrow really alluded to when he spoke to Gorbachev in January 1990.
It's amazing how things can be the same for decades and you can't see an end to it coming, and then suddenly there it is.
Exactly.
On that point, in 1985, when Mikhail Gorbachev becomes General Secretary, it did not appear that Soviet communism, despite all its problems, was a few years away from extinction. As you argue in your book, it could have held on. None of this happens, reunification of Germany, if the Soviet Union continues to exist in its pre-Gorbachev form, right?
That's right. Gorbachev was the key to all this happening. What is the case is that you can see in retrospect, of course, the weaknesses of the Soviet Union, economic weaknesses, but politically, it appeared to be completely stable at the time that Gorbachev took over. What happened was in subsequent years, between 1985 and 1989, his reforms, which were intended initially to reform the system within the Soviet Union, not to destroy it or undermine it, they nonetheless did do precisely that. They started to undermine it to the extent that by 1989, the Soviet Union was facing massive internal problems. And also Gorbachev then was increasingly let it be known that the satellite states would be allowed to go their own way, which was unthinkable to any previous Soviet leader. And once that happened then, the states, Poland and Hungary to the fore, started to push for their own development. Hungary was really the first of these countries to do so. East Germany was one of the ones that did not want to alter the system at all, but was unable to resist the pressures for change which Gorbachev had himself unleashed.
That's right. My question may have seemed like an obvious one, but I think it is important to reinforce just how dramatic these changes were and unexpected. As mentioned, when Gorbachev took power in 1985, he had no intention of ending communism, but when the train left the station, he was unable to slow it down. Let's also take a minute or two to remind folks just how different life was in the separate Germanys. Generally speaking, prosperity and freedom in the West and a sclerotic economy, and Stasi, the secret police, the Stasi, repression in the East.
There were two different worlds, and it was quite extraordinary if you experienced Germany at that time, as I did on innumerable occasions. Especially if you were in Berlin, you could cross that wall when you went from one world into another. In 1981, I lived in East Berlin for about 6 weeks or so, And I made a mistake, which with the visa, which only allowed me to go out once, namely to go back home at the end. So for 6 weeks, I was unable to cross the wall into West Berlin. And I had to adjust then to what life was like for ordinary citizens in East Berlin. And it was a very grey existence, really. So everything that you took for granted in the West was not to be taken for granted in the East. All the normal goods that you could get in the West were unavailable. Everything was a very limited, downbeat existence there. For the people who were there, of course, they adjusted to this, many of them over the previous 4 decades, and they didn't see any prospects of the wall coming down. So when there's nothing else for it, you just get on with it and you adjust to life like that. But if you came from the West, it was a bit of a culture shock going to that system. It's certainly true.
That's right. And it was an alien existence. I mean, there was nothing natural or historical about the eastern part of Germany wanting to live under communism. It was an artificial separation, as we all know. In what ways did the fall of the Berlin Wall accelerate this whole process of reunification? Or did it work? Am I getting cause and effect confused?
No, you're not. The fall of the Berlin Wall was the major impetus to start off all this, really. Until that time, nobody had really given any thought to the fact that unification might take place within the next year. I mean, it was unthinkable. And I was there in Berlin at the time, and like everyone else, it never occurred to me that we would be facing, when I went to Berlin in September 1989, I never thought that within a year we'd have accomplished the unification of Germany. It seemed unimaginable. So the opening of the wall on the 9th of November was the trigger to all these events, which then took place pell-mell, really, from November 1989 onwards. And then in the early months of 1990, gathered greater rapidity.
And the wall came down by accident. I mean, there already had been movement of people out of East Germany through other countries to get to the West. But the wall comes down, you don't have to take that circuitous route anymore. The wall comes down by accident, right?
It did, in a sense, come down by an accident on that 9th of November. Nobody was ready for it happening then when it did. There was a press conference, and the press representative of the regime, man called Günter Schabowski, then had not read or understood a directive which was coming out, which was then giving East German citizens the right to travel without massive formalities, which is what they've been pressing for. That directive was due to come into effect within a day or two, but Schabowski didn't read it properly. And when he was asked by a journalist, then he had to admit that this was offering freedom of travel for East German citizens. And when asked the question, was that from now onward? He said, yes. And does it apply to Berlin? Yes. At which people jumped in their cars, headed for the wall, and then poured over through the openings in the wall. And it was an extraordinary experience, of course, for people on both sides of the wall. And that really was the symbolic end of the Cold War, as well as the symbolic moment when German unification started to be seen as a possible eventuality in the coming year or so.
The point of my question was, my poorly framed question was, there was pressure to lift restrictions on travel between East and West because East Germans had been leaving the country and going through neighboring countries such as Austria to get to the West.
Yes, of course, East Germans had, for those same reasons, the flood of migrants from East Germany to West Germany, which had been taking place before the wall was put up. The wall was put up in 1961. And before that, the drain of manpower to western parts of Germany was so intense that the East German regime put up the Berlin Wall in August 1961 to stop precisely that happening. From then on, East German citizens were effectively walled in. And that breach in the communist system, allowing people to drift into the West, started when Hungary opened its borders in the autumn of 1989. All at once then, there was a leak in the integrity of the communist system, which meant that people could get out to the West. And once that took place, then it, of course, then encouraged more and more people to try to press to get out of Germany. And the East German regime was unable to stop that leak.
Was it right that the East German regime wanted to use repression to restore order, so to speak, but Gorbachev would not allow it?
Yes, the East German regime was really run by political dinosaurs. Even in Gorbachev's eyes, these people were dinosaurs who were resistant to any sort of change, in particular the leader of East Germany, Erich Honecker. They had relied upon the power of the Stasi within East Germany. And in the autumn of 1989, Honecker still wanted to stop the crowds that were building up, in particular in the city of Leipzig, pressing for change to the regime, wanted to repress them by force, which meant, in effect, then the possibility of shooting at them with live ammunition. The signal came from Moscow that this shouldn't be done. The crowds who turned out on these Monday demonstrations in Leipzig didn't know that, and they went out nonetheless. As the numbers grew more and more, the Soviet regime then said to the East Germans, this is to be permitted. You're not to use force against them. So reluctantly, the East Germans complied with that. And of course, once the crowds became aware that force was not going to be used, the police were not going to turn on them, then the numbers swelled even more until they reached about 500,000 or so by mid-October 1989.
You mentioned the Stasi. I'll just take a moment to let our listeners know if they want to watch a movie to learn about the Stasi. The Lives of Others, a remarkable German film.
Fabulous.
Came out a few years ago about the end of the regime and what the Stasi did to its own people. The transition or the reunification of Germany was not for Germans alone to decide. It had international implications. You had Thatcher in the UK, Mitterrand in France. They were against it. In hindsight, it seems that their concerns were misplaced, the way history has gone. But at the time, of course, they could not foresee the future. So why did France, the UK, and others oppose reunification?
It was the immediate German past, or they should have said not the immediate German past, but the wartime German past and the history of Nazism and everything that had happened there, which still cast its shadow over Europe at that time. In the case of Britain, Britain had fought a war against Germany. Mrs. Thatcher was, in a sense, a child of the Second World War, of that Churchill was her great hero. She was very reluctant to see a new Germany, which she feared would take the same path as the old Germany. Mitterrand, the French premier, was also concerned about the growth of a new, strong Germany in the middle of Europe. After all, France had been invaded from across the Rhine in 1870, in 1914 and 1940. So the French had very good cause to be concerned about what would happen. Other countries, too, were not very happy at the prospect of Germany, which now a much bigger country, a united country, would, they fear, start throwing its weight around in Europe. And they were not too happy with that. From the point of view of Gorbachev and the Soviet Union, of course, they fought a war which had cost the lives of about 27 million Russians, or Soviet citizens anyway. And they were fearful of what a new united Germany would bring. And Germany was still effectively, with hundreds of thousands of foreign troops on its soil, was still, Berlin particularly, then under the control of the four wartime powers of the Soviet Union, the United States, Britain, and France. And so these international complications had to be got over before unification could take place. And within those, there was also then the issue, the very current issue, of the role of NATO, which, of course, a Western alliance facing the Warsaw Pact, the Eastern Alliance. And the Soviet Union was extraordinarily reluctant, or in fact, not say completely rejected, the notion that NATO should cross the German border and become now a part of both Germans, be situated in both German states, not just in West Germany.
I want to get to NATO because it is fascinating how these issues stay in the news. 3 decades later, we're talking about the role of NATO again. But about the West, or on the Western side of this equation, the breakthrough came when Helmut Kohl, West Germany's leader, and Mitterrand in France agreed a unified Germany would be integrated with the western half of Europe.
Yes, this was the crucial deal. Germany and France between them, or should I say West Germany initially, West Germany and France between them have been the crucial figures in the development of the European community, as it was, ideas of an integrated Europe. Once the wall had come down, the relations between Germany and France were absolutely pivotal. it was, in a sense, a sort of deal that if you could integrate West Germany in an integrated Western Europe, then the danger from Germany would be greatly diminished. And from the French point of view, a way to do this was to get a common European currency, which would also bind Germany into Europe. So the idea of an integrated Europe and German unification were, in that sense, two sides of the same coin.
The seeds of the EU there being planted. So George H.W. Bush, the United States, is in favor of reunification, provided the unified Germany becomes part of NATO. And that was a thorny subject. You mentioned Gorbachev. I believe in your book you mentioned something about in early 1990, he stated his adamant opposition to having a reunified Germany in NATO. That's about 2 years before Gorbachev himself exits the stage. December of 1991, the Soviet Union is extinct. He's not sitting there in early 1990 knowing that fact, that in 2 years he will no longer be the ruler of the Soviet Union, that there won't be a Soviet Union. So from his vantage point in 1990, he sees a NATO with Germany in it as a major problem.
Yes, he does. It's also a prestige factor that accepting that NATO would spread to a former Soviet satellite was tantamount to an open admission that the Western powers, and the United States in particular, had won the Cold War. So it was something that, from even on prestige grounds, the Soviet Union was unhappy to accept. But more importantly than that, it did mean then that this new, potentially powerful Germany will now have the backing of NATO, and the Warsaw Pact will be massively weakened. But we have also to remember that at this point, the Soviet Union was itself in a critical state, politically and economically. It had been greatly weakened by Gorbachev's reforms and what had taken place. And so Gorbachev was playing a very poor hand of cards by that stage.
That's right.
That enabled Helmut Kohl, to the German chancellor, in dealings with President Bush, to say we may be able to get over this NATO issue by offering Gorbachev money, buying our way out of it. And in a sense, that's what happened, that Gorbachev was offered large amounts of support, mainly from Germany, as a return for the deal to accept the extension of NATO to the former East Germany.
Gorbachev is still a hero to many in the West, but in the former Soviet Union, his reputation is not good. His reforms failed, and the country is no longer a superpower. There must have been practical problems that had to be overcome to reunify the two sides of Germany, but it seems to have gone remarkably smoothly.
It did, in a way, go remarkably smoothly. There were big difficulties, technical difficulties about the economy and about the actual process of integrating East Germany into a unified Germany. The question there that arose was whether that should be done, whether the constitution of West Germany should be scrapped altogether and a new constitution drawn up. And that was fraught with all sorts of difficulties. It would have been a long process. And so they came down with the easier solution, which was actually to incorporate the 5 regions of East Germany into the existing West German state, now calling it a united Germany. That was, in a sense, therefore, a takeover rather than a merger of equals. And that's what happened. So under Article 23 of the West German Constitution, then East Germany was incorporated in it. The other question that remained was the economic union. And that was massively difficult because the East German economy, we've already touched upon it, I think, was really moribund. There was nothing there that existed in the West. The infrastructure was ancient, antiquated and run down. And the businesses there, most of them were state-owned businesses, were just not capable of being competitive in a capitalist system. And the exchange rate, the actual exchange rate of the East German mark to the West German mark was about 1:8 or 1:9. That was the realistic exchange rate, and you could get that at the black market. But the exchange rate, which was finally agreed upon, was 1:1. So you get one West German mark, strongest currency in Europe, for one East German mark, which was actually worthless. And that was brilliant. If you got savings of 4,000 East German marks, you got 1:1. So East German citizens had this worthless currency, which all at once enabled to buy things. That made the East German economy still more difficult to sustain because these East German businesses were actually hopelessly uncompetitive. And trying to sell them then also was difficult because nobody wanted to buy them initially. So the result of this was massive unemployment. Effectively, you were taking over a bankrupt concern, and massive unemployment as businesses were run down altogether. And the people who had secure jobs, often non-jobs in a very poor economy, were now without jobs at all. So this placed an enormous burden on Germany as a whole now, on the unified German economy, to bail these out. And it was a burden which effectively held the economy of unified Germany back for about a decade.
Wow, that's a great point. Reflecting on communism, one of its supposed advantages over capitalist systems was that it had full employment. But as you said, many of these jobs in East Germany were non-jobs. We can start wrapping up by reflecting upon just how surreal these events seem from our current perspective. You were in Berlin, as you said, in 1989. You witnessed the fall of the wall. I was 14 years old. I suppose I was a freshman in high school at that point. But I do remember looking at those large maps pinned to the walls of my school classrooms and seeing this entire swath of the world ruled by communism and the separation between East and West Germany, and probably thinking that world would be the only world I'd know. And here we are. That world is gone, and it doesn't seem like in some sense it ever existed because things have gone so well in Europe since.
Indeed, that is the case.
At least from my American perspective, Sir Ian, because not being a European, I don't live with that same sense of history of two world wars on my own continent.
No, but your reflections are much the same as younger Europeans would have now. I've been to Berlin with students and with members of my family and so on. And of course, they can theoretically understand it, but they can't really grasp what it was like to have these two completely separate parts of Europe, or what it was like for us to be unable to visit Prague or Budapest or Warsaw with any ease, or let alone for the people in those areas to come to the West. So it is a vanished world, which is very difficult to recapture mentally as well. And it's undoubtedly, Europe is a far better place than it was then. It's wonderful now that we can travel all over everywhere as we did and so on, as we were unable to do then. And yet, of course, like everywhere else, Europe is faced with many current problems. We touched upon them earlier. And there aren't many people, I think, who are given the choice would actually want to go back to what it was like before 1989. So in that sense, it has been a very beneficial development for the whole of Europe.
I remember that observation in your book about imagine living in Europe and not being able to travel from France to Poland.
Yeah.
Seems crazy, but that was the reality for half a century almost.
It was. Yes, it was. And when we were in Berlin, of course, for months after the wall had come down, we couldn't easily travel into East Germany without still getting the relevant papers. I mean, it wasn't that everything changed the minute that the wall was opened. I remember going to Weimar in East Germany in the spring, March, I think it was, in 1990. And I still had to travel from my part in the west of West Berlin over into East Berlin to get the relevant papers to enable me to travel easily in East Germany. So it wasn't that everything automatically altered the second that the wall came down, but it was nonetheless the forcing ground for everything that took place subsequently.
And the notion that a strong Germany, powerful, influential at the heart of Europe, is necessary when at one point that was a scary idea, really tells you all you need to know about Europe's transformation.
Yes, indeed. And as I said, that is the dilemma for Germans now, that they reluctant to play the part of the powerful country, and yet Europe needs them to play a more assertive role than they do at times. We need Germany to be a beneficent, strong component of the new Europe. That will unquestionably be the face of the future in Europe as well. So that too has been a dramatic change that's taken place since the end of communism and the end of the Cold War in 1989 and 1990.
Sir Ian Kershaw, we thank you for your time.
It's a great pleasure. Very enjoyable talking to you.
And I will tell our listeners, if you're looking for something to read and have had enough of the 2 world wars, pick up Sir Ian's The Global Age about the second half of that century. He's also writing a new book. It doesn't have a title yet. It'll be about personality and power in 20th century Europe. On the next episode of History as It Happens, Nixon Shadow.
Because people have got to know whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
At a time when the executive branch possesses enormous power, and as we learn more of how a certain former president had tried to stay in power after losing an election, have we forgotten the lessons of Watergate? Are we not still living in Nixon's shadow? That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.